just make sure we're streaming, and we should be
Is Nahal in?
good to go. I do not see him.
Interesting.
Yes. Making a note on that. Are you okay to go without him, Michelle?
Sure.
Okay. Let me know if you need any support, okay?
Okay.
Perfect. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Kristen. I'm here representing Holberton School. We have a fireside chat with our guest, Florent Crivello, who you may know from some of his projects at Jumpstarter and Uber Works. The Jumpstarter you may notice in some of the large cities like San Francisco with the scooters and bikes around. You may see those around. And here with us to interview him is Michelle Domingo from Cohort 11. So I'll just let Michelle take it away and let me know if you need anything.
Thank you so much, Kristen. Hey everyone, my name is Michelle Domingo. I'm a student in the second trimester of the foundational year curriculum at Holberton. And thank you, Holberton, for the opportunity. And thank you so much, Florent, for your time in sharing your knowledge and experiences with us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. So before the coronavirus pandemic hit, the remote job market was on the rise, and with more and more workers seeking out flexible arrangements that allow them to work from home or to travel. And as a career changer myself, I decided to start my software engineering journey at Holberton to gain more skills that will hopefully also allow me to travel while working. One of the effects from the pandemic has been a huge increase in the number of Americans or just people from all around the world working from home. Florent, what do you see, where do you see the remote work trend heading?
Yeah, up. I think we talked about that briefly earlier. Like, if you look at the annual developer survey that Stack Overflow puts out, I think you can see that the number of the proportion of software engineers who work mostly remotely is growing by roughly 10% every year. So that's not quite hockey stick growth, but that kind of stuff compounds very quickly, and I do believe it is accelerating. Like, on the one hand, I'm still like a huge believer in the virtues of collocated work. Like, I just think it's actually very high bandwidth in a lot of ways. But on the other hand, well, obviously right now because of the coronavirus, like we're forced to all be remote. So like we have to figure this out, like for better or for worse. But also like, I just think that like the advantages of remote work are too good to pass upon. Like we have to figure this out because it's just so good, right? Like, don't build any housing in San Francisco. So at some point, like we're gonna outgrow the ecosystem. I'm surprised that we haven't already done that. You know, like you allow everybody to work from anywhere. You allow companies to hire anybody to pay vastly lower wages while offering as good, if not better, of a living to their employees than if they take any other kind of job. I think studies do show pretty consistently that remote workers are happier. And I think all of the other inconvenience, I think we can figure out, right? I just think even if you compare to like 10 or 20 years ago, the tooling to work remotely has gotten so much better, right? Like now we have Google Docs, we have Zoom, we have Figma. Like just try to imagine a world where you don't have these tools. Like how do you even work without those, right? And I do believe that that trend is going to accelerate as well, where like the tools that we get are going to get much better. And I actually think that not only is remote work going to become as good as collocated eventually, I think it's going to become better, right? You're never going to have to fight for meeting rooms anymore. You never have to commute anymore, right? Just like save like 1 to 2 hours per person per day. It's like a huge, huge deal, right? You're not as interrupted anymore. You can spend more time with your family. I just think, and obviously you save on rent too. You save on rent for the office. So the advantages are just too good to pass upon, and like we have to figure out the tooling.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely. And so with these changes of being remote, I'm helping Michelle because our other interviewer was unable to make it. With these changes and being remote, how do you keep yourself and others in your team, motivated and feeling productive when facing these changes, especially when we're all transitioning and maybe we're not used to this remote work yet?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if I have a super strong answer. I'm struggling with it just as much as the next guy. I can tell you what not to do. And I do believe at some point at Uber, my team was half distributed. And I think that's the worst thing you can do. I think being half distributed is much harder than being fully distributed. And that is something that we hear pretty consistently from people who have experience with remote teams. Because when you're half distributed and you have like a kernel of people who are co-located, it has two effects. One is it creates this like first class citizen, second class citizen dynamic. And two is it removes the forcing function for you to figure out how to make remote work work. And whereas if you're fully distributed, you have no other choice, right? And so I don't have a clear answer to you yet. I am working on actually, as a matter of fact, I'm actually working on such a product right now. But I think like having the habit of scheduling coffee meetings, trying to recreate some of these dynamics that you get when you're co-located and that you get for free, but like trying to recreate them deliberately, such as like, the serendipitous corridor conversations and like the water cooler conversations and all of that is key. Again, I think today I see some companies such as GitLab and stuff like pull out remote work, like fully distributed work. I must admit, I'm not sure yet how they do it.
Yeah, I know that's something we're all working on. And even at Holborn, of course,
Yeah.
with our students, even we've added like after our everyday stand up, we've added like, conversations, stick around if you want to chat, having that deliberate space where it's not necessarily about coding, but it can be, which we would have naturally on campus. So I think that's such a good point.
Yeah, I mean, you have, again, co-location is spatial, right? Like you have this like ambient awareness of your surroundings, right? You're coding, but you also see if like in the corner of your eye, if three people are just hanging out in the corner, or if they're having a conversation that is relevant to your work, and you can just join them, right? Whereas, for example, a Zoom meeting is just this like link that floats in the ether, and you don't know if your coworkers are like hanging out in the Zoom meeting. That's just one of the many dynamics that disappears when you're like fully remote. And I do believe we will crack them eventually. And I do believe, like, especially because of coronavirus, like I think this is the one good thing that will come out of coronavirus is like it is forcing us out of this local maximum that we were stuck on.
Yeah, it's very interesting to just kind of dissect the many levels of how coronavirus has sort of affected our lives personally and professionally. And it's definitely more challenging with the varieties of like uncertainty and changes in life to, kind of navigate with sheltering in place. One thing that I'm a huge fan of is like productivity apps. And so that's kind of helped me to stay motivated and accountable. And I'm kind of under the impression that Florent, you live your life by design and not by default. So how would you describe your experience climbing from software engineer to head of product at UberWorks and then jump starter?
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if like by design, like, yes, like I try to live deliberately, but like, I don't know if by design, I wouldn't say there was like a grand master plan or whatever. As a matter of fact, I was hanging out, like one of the points of like that journey was like, I was hanging out one evening in the cafeteria at Uber. I was like 8 or something. And I was next to Andrei Liskovich, who's now the CEO of UberWorks. And his title is actually CEO because it's like a separate legal entity. And he was talking about this thing. Like at the time, he was a data scientist, and it was really more of like an idea than anything else. And so he was looking for someone to help him with this, right? And so I just started like hacking on the side, like stuff to like really make a proof of concept and unlock funding internally. I'm generally not a fan of the term intrapreneurship, because I think that it creates the false notion that it's anything close to entrepreneurship when it's not. Like you have like different constraints and you have different incentives, so it's very different from entrepreneurship. But this was about as close to entrepreneurship as it gets inside a big company. Like we actually raised money and like we had like a separate legal entity and we had like a separate office and all of that stuff. Yeah, I mean, like it's just, when we unlocked the funding, then we had headcount and we could hire people. And then like just naturally, I had an interest in product and also I had more leverage this way, right? And so that also was like I think like a better fit for my interests. And so like I just like naturally settled upon this position. And then as the team started growing, like I was just like a natural fit for like, you know, having these folks report to me and leading that part of the project. Yeah.
Wow, that's actually pretty kind of inspiring, but also a little scary. Like anyone can fall into these leadership roles, right?
Well, I do think it takes, like, I don't want to make it look like, oh my god, like it just happened, right? It's like there were definitely like a few sit downs with other. I was like, okay, like I'm committing to this, and like I think people like don't realize like you can take a risk in your career even in like while staying in the same company, right? Sundar Pichai, like one of the big step ups in his career inside Google was like he led the Google Chrome team, right? Which ended up like it started as like a small thing, and then it ended up being like a giant strategic asset for Google, right? And it was a risk for him, right? I forgot the name also of the person who is now leading Google Maps, which is also a giant org at Google. And she was a software engineer, and I believe she transitioned from AdWords, which is like the core of Google's business, to Google Maps, which at the point was like, well, why is Google even doing maps, right? And so yeah, there was like a risk-taking component to it. Like I transitioned from, at the time I was an engineer working in a driver org, and the driver team was starting a rewrite of the driver app in Swift and like using like a bunch of like new modern frameworks. And I mean, this would have been like an amazing opportunity for my career to like get visibility and to contribute to like a project that was hugely important, like driver app, right? It's just like half the business, and the other half is rider. And like many folks back then were telling me like, why are you doing Uber Works? So like for context, Uber Works is basically the Uber of staffing agencies. And everybody was telling me, do you really believe that like this will amount to anything? Like, do you really believe, you know, and still today, it's obviously much smaller than the core business. So like, but there is obviously like a risk-taking component to it. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Oh, so with that risk, you obviously take the risk of failure too. So how do you overcome that failure when it, you know, inevitably does come?
I mean, I don't know if I would call it inevitable.
Well, no, I mean like in my sorry. I mean like the small failures along the way too, right? Throughout your career or your day.
Yeah. No, I hear you.
So sorry.
I hear you. No, totally. Like I was thinking like, did it happen? But yeah, I mean, there were like a bunch of setbacks. I mean, like, there are the just the usual things that you can do to reduce stress, right? It's you know, like, I mean, cliche but true, like meditation. Like I just try to meditate like 1 or 2 hours a week. I try to get a ton of sleep, especially when I'm going through tough times. So like typically 8 to 10 hours a night, closer to 10. Try to get a ton of social contact. And then I also find that like not trying to hide the struggle is a big part of it. Like the times in my life when like I've struggled the most and when I was trying to pretend that I was killing it, and I see a lot of people do that, I feel like it actually makes it worse because it isolates you, right? And I think being open with your team, with everybody, that yeah, this is a tough time for everybody, right? That is a thing I do, and that helps me. And I'm always baffled. Like I recognize that it's a big part of the job of a leader to always project an impression of confidence, right? But one of my life principles, I think it comes from the book, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, or Good to Great, one of these two. And it's like face reality, yet never lose faith, right? And so if you think of like this, like a 2x2 like that, like it's very easy to like keep faith and be in denial. It's very easy to like face reality and be depressed, but it's hard to like face reality and never lose faith, right? But I think that like that's what leaders should do, right? And I see many leaders who like keep a happy face and like everything's gonna be great, and it's just deny the shit's hitting the fan, right? And I feel like that sucks because in a way it erodes trust, because everybody knows like, why don't we just address the elephant in the room here, right? And it erodes trust, and in a way it also makes time harder on everybody because everybody feels like they can't share what they're going through, right? So I feel like that's a big part of it, right? It's like being open about the tough time, and at the same time, you know, not losing faith and being like, hey, we're going through this thing, but we're gonna overcome. And then, I mean, keeping going, right? Like, I mean, like there were definitely a few setbacks. I mean, I made like a bunch of mistakes, and, you know, hiring mistakes and just like mistakes, period, right? That did a lot of damage to the team. I think it's key to just not linger upon them, right? Like, I mean, reflect upon them and draw the lessons that they are to draw, and then just like keep moving. Travis was always saying, like Travis Kalanick, the founder of Uber, he was always quoting, I think it was, I don't know if it was Muhammad Ali or like Rambo, like from the movie Rambo, but he was saying, like a true champion isn't defined by how hard he can hit, but like by how hard he gets hit and keeps getting back up. And there is that like amazing, super inspiring video of that person, like that sprinter who falls like in the beginning of the sprint and then gets back up and immediately starts back running and ends up winning the race. And it's like a real video. And it's like the most beautiful thing. And I think that's key, right? Just like not lingering upon the past and just like keeping going. And I actually think that's like a very big part of healing, right? Like keeping yourself busy and not viewing your failure as a reflection of yourself, right? And just keeping it localized in time and space, right? It's like, okay, this happened, but this is not a reflection of me. I'm not a piece of shit. This is just like this project was a failure at that moment, and now let's keep going, and I'm going to succeed in the future.
Yeah, there's so much to learn from setbacks, and sometimes it's hard to realize that every idea or decision or life situation isn't, it's not going to work out like how you expect it to. And as a Holberton student, as we prepare to transition into the workplace, we have our technical and behavioral mock interviews with our peers and trying to figure out like what type of companies we want to work for. And I know no work environment is ever perfect, but maybe it's like a fear of failure or perhaps not fitting into a company culture that makes job offers a huge or like expensive decision on both the candidate and employer's end. So Florent, as a product leader, what's your favorite job interview question for screening for cultural fit?
Yeah, I feel like it depends on the culture that you want to screen for, right? I don't think there's a universal answer to this question. But at Uber, we screened a lot for work ethic and for hustle, and for resilience, right? So all these things that we mentioned earlier. And so, I mean, I think it's important to just ask yourself that question first, right? It's like, what culture are you screening for? Ben Horowitz wrote that amazing book about cultures, corporate cultures recently that I cannot recommend enough. That's called What You Do Is Who You Are. And one of the key points of the book is that your culture out to support the strategy that you've decided was the best course for your company. So for example, Amazon famously has a culture of thriftiness, right? Because they're actually in retail, which is like a very low margin business. And so they need to be thrifty, right? But that culture of thriftiness is not necessarily the best fit for like, say, Facebook or Google, right? So again, depending on what business you're in, different cultures make different sense. So first, identifying your competitive context, identifying your strategic position, identifying what culture needs to support your strategy, and then identifying the questions that, stress for that culture. I think one thing that's very important is that whatever question you ask, it needs to ask for concretes, not theoreticals, right? Like not what would you do in there, but like ask them concretely in what ways, like seek for concrete ways that they have demonstrated the cultural values that you're trying to select for, right? So again, like at Uber, we're trying to select for these things like hustle and work ethic and resilience. And so one thing that I liked to ask was, what's the toughest part of your career, right? Like what's been the toughest part of your career, right? And it's very hard to bullshit on this question because generally it is so emotionally loaded for people that it's, if they've really lived through like a tough part, oh wow, Siri is freaking out. If people have really lived through like a tough part in their life, like that, you're gonna tell, right? It's real. And then just, digging and double clicking again and again and again. I'm a big fan of like follow-up questions and just ask like 10 follow-up questions and tell me more. How did you handle it? What happened? Why did you do this? Right? Yeah.
I think that's very interesting of like, what do you ask for? Because like, what do you look for in the role of the perspective of different roles, right? You may need different types of people. And so your perspective on the role of a product manager versus role of a product leader, like they sound very synonymous, but are those very different? Could you explain those differences? or do you have like a specific perspective on those roles?
Yeah, I don't think I've seen the title product leader in the wild all that much. Like most of the time, people are product managers. I feel like the distinction between leader and manager extends beyond the role of a product manager, right? I think it's really in general like people are managers or leaders. One way that you often see the distinction being defined is that manager is almost like a backward-facing activity, right? It's like you manage like the day-to-day operation and existence of a complex operation, which is an art and it's like super complex. And like good managers are very rare and extremely valuable. And the leader is focused more on the touchy-feely part of the job, right? And the psychological part of the job, which tends to be overlooked, especially by engineers, right? Who think in terms of systems and stuff, and tend to overlook the psychological part, which is, I think, the most important part, right? And so the leader is going to be more of like a forward-facing kind of thing, and like trying to like rally people around a common vision, trying to communicate that vision, trying to get that pumped, trying to get them pumped about that vision, like trying to get them inspired, trying to get them motivated, trying to make the team bond and gel, I think is like super important. And then even beyond the psychological aspect, I think there is an aspect of this distinction between management and leadership that is about, I forgot who it is. Like there is like a management author, I believe, like in Harvard, who like talks about the opportunity gap, the performance gap, right? And the performance gap is about doing what your job entails on a day-to-day well, right? Just like your performance. And then the opportunity gap is doing what you could be doing, right? It's just like following, it's almost like a 0 to 1, right? So an example would be like, hey, I'm Apple in like 2000s, early 2000s. My performance gap is making better Macs and a better OS and whatnot, or like a better iPad. My opportunity gap is the iPhone, right? And so one is about the could and the other one is about the should, right? And so I view the manager as managing the performance gap and the leader as managing the opportunity gap, right? Which is super hard, right? Especially inside a big company.
Yeah, they both seem very hard and vital roles in companies and teams.
100%. And I don't know if you guys have seen that documentary on Netflix that's called Wild Wild Country. Oh man, I cannot recommend it enough. It's such a good documentary. It's a true story, and I cannot believe it's not a better-known story. It's like in the 70s, there was that commune of people, like hippies, basically, that built a city in the middle of Oregon. And then they ran into a bunch of legal woes, and they turned into bioterrorists. It's a whole thing. But basically, in that commune, you see the guru. He's like a literal guru, and everybody calls him as such. Osho. And he gives speeches and he writes books, and he's like a very deep spiritual being or whatever. And then you have his chief of staff, basically, who's man named Sheila, who's like a very, very colorful character, very fierce. And I really think of one as the leader and the other as the manager, right? Like the man and Sheila manages the day-to-day of the operation, and she's an amazing manager if you remove the bioterrorism part. And the guru is a guru, right? He's like a totem for the thing, right? And if you have just the guru without having man and Sheila, you just have like a dysfunctional commune, as like all of them were. And if you have just man and Sheila without having the guru, then you just have like a home ownership association. Basically, it has no soul, right? So you need these two things, right?
Can you say the documentary again? The title?
It's called Wild Wild Country.
Wild Wild Country. Okay.
It's like in 6 parts. I've seen it twice. It's such a good documentary.
Okay. Another rabbit hole for me to go down. Thank you.
It's so good.
Okay. And yeah, just to touch upon the kind of differences you're talking about between management and leadership in product roles. Can you also maybe expand upon the relationship between like a product manager and an engineer and what that looks like for you?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I mean, the product manager obviously depends upon the engineer to do their job. And at the same time, they have no formal authority over the engineer. And so that is one of the things that product managers complain about very often. They say, like Uncle, what's the name of the uncle in Spider-Man, Uncle Ben or whatever? Yeah, isn't that the rice Uncle Ben or whatever? And he says, like, with great power comes great responsibility. And PMs joked that like with all the responsibility comes no power, right? So you have to deliver on a certain set of goals. You can't do it yourself. You depend on engineers and designers and data scientists, and you have no power over these folks, right? And maybe I'm just trying to look for like the silver lining of this, but I think one of the great parts about this is that it forces you to develop the muscle of exerting influence and of developing informal leadership, right? And informal authority, right? And it really makes this concept very salient for you, because you're like, wait a minute, like you see the very best PMs have a tremendous amount of authority, even though technically they have no authority. They can't fire anybody or whatever, right? And so I think that relationship is between the PM and the engineer is about, you know, fostering trust is super important, because at the end of the day, that's what it's going to come down to. Like fostering trust in your competence and fostering trust in your character. Like these two things are super important. And just having a good human relationship, like having a relationship of trust and accountability and transparency with the engineer, so you can rely on them when you need to, I think is key between the PM and the engineer. And then there is the other relationship that you need to talk about, which is the relationship between the PM and the EM, the engineering manager, because the EM is the one who actually does have formal authority, right? And so I find that as a last resort, being able to have that formal authority by proxy through the EM is a very important thing to have. And so that's why also the relationship between the PM and the EM, I think is the number one and number two most important relationship in the team. I think a close contender would be that between the product manager and the designer, who also need to be like a very strong team.
Oh, go ahead, Michelle, if you're going to say something.
Just a follow-up question for, I guess, a software engineer interested in transitioning maybe into a product role. What are your recommended skills and maybe mindsets to develop to kind of make that move?
Yeah, communication, I think, is the most important one and the first one. Product management is extremely cross-functional, very multidisciplinary, which makes it fascinating, but also super hard. So you kind of have to be at least okay in a lot of things and great in a few things, right? And so you have, all of these things, and you choose what you're great at. But like there is like this whole menu that you need to be at least okay in, right? Engineering, obviously, design, data science. Like you should be able to like get answers to your data questions yourself. Like you shouldn't have to like depend upon a data scientist for like the simplest questions. Marketing for sure. Finance, like very often, your product has a financial impact on the company, right? Business strategy. I think all of that. And then when it comes to communication, there are very different media in which one expresses themselves, right? And so there is like one-on-ones, which are like an art in and of themselves, right? But then there's also like group communication, presentations, but then also informal presentations, right? Like sometimes you just have like there is like an impromptu team meeting, and you just have to like not make stuff up, but like you have to be able to like make a compelling answer to like something that pops up. You can't just wait for like 2 weeks until you've written the perfect answer to that, right? And then obviously, yes, written communication. And then there's like emails, like one-on-one emails, group emails, and like document emails, and understanding each of these media and mastering them, or like being good, being okay in at least a few of them and being great in some of them is also a must. And then all of the touchy-feely stuff that I mentioned about leadership, which I find that many engineers, myself included, like vastly overlook in the beginning.
Yeah, and we noticed that here at Holberton too. And so we have actually a book club was started by one of our campuses of reading on emotional intelligence. And I'm not a part of the book club. I had too many meetings, but it's really interesting to hear about it. And I hope to pick it up myself, because we're seeing more and more that it is very important to learn about ourselves and others and how we relate to each other.
For sure. There is that book that I really recommend about it that's called Peopleware. And so, the very title of the book summarizes it, right? It's not software, it's peopleware, right? At the end of the day, it's about the team, right? And everything is downstream of the team. And so they say that, especially engineers, again, tend to focus on like, okay, the project is failing. Maybe we don't have the right tooling, maybe we don't have the right process, we should adopt Scrum, we should adopt Agile or whatever, right? And that book makes the case that actually you should focus on the psychology, right? Most of the time when a project is failing, it's a human problem, it's not a process problem or a tooling problem, right? And so as long as a team that is going to have the psychology aspect right is going to succeed even if it has the tooling wrong, right? And vice versa, right? A team that has the tooling wrong but doesn't get the psychology right is going to fail, right? And when you think about it, it makes sense, right? I mean, look, we did massively complex projects like the Apollo 8 and Apollo 11, or I mean, even like smaller than that, just like Mac OS, right? Like projects like that before internet was a thing, right? They had no Google Docs, right? And if you read books, what's the name of that book? I think it's The Mystical Man Month or something, where he talks about how documentation was maintained back then. It's like literally you received in your office pages of documentation and you had like a binder and you removed like page 8 every day and you inserted page 8. And it's like you just like did your own like Git system in your binder, right? So people managed to make huge projects work before they had Asana and Scrum and Agile, right? So I definitely the touchy-feely aspects, the psychological component is so much more important than people realize.
Oh, it's so fun to hear about, but I'm glad we're past binders for documentation
Yes.
most of the time.
Yeah.
I do want to open up the floor for any questions from our attendees here. We do have a Q&A section if you do want to ask those. While you put those questions in, we do have just maybe, I think, 1 or 2 more questions here for you, Florent. One's a fun one. So how would you explain natural process languaging models to a 5th grader?
Yeah. Well, I wonder what 5th grader wants to know about this, but I wish my 5th graders will be like this. Yeah, I mean, it's about making computers able to understand language and able to understand written language and able to generate writing, to write themselves. So it's like when you give a piece of text to a computer, they just see letters, but like with NLP, they actually understand what the text means.
Oh, so succinct and perfect. I want to put that right in our curriculum. Perfect. And then Michelle, did you have any last ones, I think, here?
Sure. And then how would you describe general adversarial networks to a 5th grader?
I know you guys have this in the courses. This is pretty cool, man. I wish I was in school today. Like these things are like pretty cool things to study. Yeah, I mean, they're basically, from what I understand, they're basically 2 AIs fighting each other. And so one's job is, for example, to generate fake pictures of faces, and the other's job is to detect fake pictures of faces. And so they're fighting, and one gets better at generating better pictures, and the other gets better at detecting them. And so normally you're most interested in like the generating part, right? Which is why that's called generative adversarial networks. And so little by little you get better and better fake pictures, or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, and if you're interested in that, Holberton students, you can learn about that in the machine learning specialization.
Well,
so that's a little sneak peek from Florent, actually.
maybe I'll take you up on this.
Yeah. Perfect. Okay, so I don't actually see any questions, but we do have the AMA on Instagram or Twitter if anyone does want to participate. Florent has been very kind in saying he will check in on that with us tomorrow. But is there any final thoughts from you, Florent, for us? Because we just wanted to say thank you for being here with us, and we just really appreciate your time and all the information and wisdom you've given us.
Yeah, you're welcome. This is always a pleasure.
Perfect. Thank you so much, everyone, and I hope you have a great evening.
Bye.
Bye.